Hello and welcome to Hema Now, EMJ's dedicated haematology podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Glass, for this special two-part highlights episode where we revisit the incredible lineup of experts who joined us throughout the year and reflect on some of the key moments from the series. From sickle cell disease and myelodysplastic syndromes to advances in leukemia and lymphoma, we've covered a broad spectrum of topics, and I'm delighted to look back at some of the standout insights. We opened the year in January with two remarkable guests. Mark Hoffman from the University of Kansas Medical Center discussed his work developing innovative therapies for B-cell malignancies. Meanwhile, Anna Sureda, president of the EBMT, provided invaluable perspective on breakthrough treatments in lymphoma and stem cell transplantation. Let's revisit some of their most impactful moments.
Let's come on to that. So you focus on stem cell transplantation and lymphomas. Can you tell us the most meaningful advances in each of those two over the last few years? What's at the horizon or just over the horizon? And what are some of the unique challenges that exist in treating these conditions? I know from the perspective of an outsider, a simple surgeon, I've seen your specialty flourish during my professional lifetime. Diseases that I learned in medical school were fatal, you've turned into chronic diseases. So lymphoma first, some of the advances, most meaningful advances, and what's just at or over the horizon, and then talk about how stem cell transplantation has grown.
So you are absolutely right. I think that those of us that dedicate to hematology nowadays, we have to be really very happy with a lot of hope because we have been able to significantly improve the outcomes of our patients. That being a clinician, of course, this is the major objective of our daily work. So if we start with lymphomas, of course, we have many different types of lymphomas, but without going into specific details, I would say that lymphomas have seen in the last few years a lot of treatment advances, and of course a lot of precision in terms of diagnosis. So if I start with the beginning, lymphomas are more and more complex. We have more technologies starting from the lab that allow us to better identify the type of disease that each one of our patients has. And of course, not all of them, even if you talk about B-cell lymphoma, about follicular lymphoma, not all these patients have the same prognosis. And at the end of the day, not all of them are going to be treated in the same way. So one of the major advances that we have seen in the last few years is our capacity even to go to next generation sequencing and molecular techniques to better diagnose our patients and to be able to allocate a better prognosis and, of course, treatment strategies. If we move to treatment strategies, the reality is that nowadays we have in our hands not only chemotherapy that has been the basis for the treatment of patients with lymphomas since the very beginning, since I started with in my medical school, but we have the possibility to use targeted therapies. These targeted therapies, of course, they are directed to specific pathways that are being pathological in patients with lymphomas. They are really effective treatments, and we are understanding how to combine them with the old treatment strategies, so basically with chemotherapy, and or eventually avoid chemotherapy just to try to avoid all the early, midterm, and long-term side effects that chemotherapy has. So we have been able to improve the outcomes, and we have been able to improve also the toxicity profile of all the treatments that we are offering to our patients. And this applies not only to non-Hodgkin lymphoma, that basically represents 70% or 65% of all the lymphomas, but also to Hodgkin lymphoma, which is the one that I have dedicated most of my hours since the very beginning. If I have to tell you two names about really treatment strategies that are going to move forward the field even more in the future. I can talk about CAR T cells. I'm sure that everybody knows about CAR T cells, which is a very, I would say, a very intelligent and wise way to use our autologous, well, the autologous T cells of the patient, basically to modify them genetically and to use them to fight against the disease when they are reinfused into the patient. So they are very effective. They have an acceptable toxicity profile, and they have opened a different pathway for hematological malignancies and even outside hematology. So they are being tested in solid tumors, they are being tested in autoimmune diseases. So there is a new field probably that it's going to be more and more explored in the near future. And then I also want to mention bispecific monoclonal antibodies that basically are T cell engagers. And what they are doing is that they are directing the T cells of the patients against the malignant cells. So that would be, let's say, a little bit my summary for lymphoma.
In February, we were joined by Frederick Scholzwold, a leading figure in myeloma research at Oslo University Hospital, who explored advancements in myeloma care, including CAR T therapies and biospecific antibodies. Eaton Stein, chief of the Leukemia Service at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, then shared fascinating insight into the genetic and epigenetic drivers of myeloid malignancies. Let's take another listen to some of their discussion.
Before we were chatting, I told you my background as a surgeon, so I speak grunt, and I'm a bit of a dullard about many things. But even a dullard like me is aware of the genetic drivers of malignancies, myeloid malignancies. But what of epigenetic factors? Can you explain some of the key findings from your work and how they're influencing the future of targeted therapies in leukemia? It's a fascinating space.
Yeah, so a lot of the targeted therapies, the targeted therapies that are approved now, two of them are actually really against sort of epigenetic drivers of disease. One of those would be um, targeted inhibitors of IDH and the menin inhibitors, which we just mentioned. And that's because when you think about these drugs, what they're not necessarily causing a direct um, cessation of signaling of an abnormally mutant protein. So if you think about lung cancer, where you have, let's say an EGFR mutation, and you're directly targeting that EGFR mutation, with a drug like osimertinib or erlotinib or the drugs that they give people, that's stopping a signaling cascade. What these epigenetic modifying drugs are doing is they're, by a variety of different mechanisms, without getting into it too specifically, is they are reprogramming and or silencing epigenetic marks on the genome that are causing or inhibiting the transcription of leukemogenic genes. So it's not a direct effect on an aberrant signaling pathway. It's more of a reprogramming of genes to be expressed or not be expressed. And that's what leads to the therapeutic benefit.
Moving into March, Xavier Lilou, head of the myeloma clinic in Lille, France, highlighted emerging research in multiple myeloma and the direction of future treatment strategies. Let's hear what he had to say.
Looking ahead, going back to multiple myeloma, do you think the future of treatment here will continue to involve CD38 targeted immunotherapies like the unpronounceable MAB drugs? Or do you foresee it's just a mental block for me? I don't know what it is. I mean, I can say lymphoplasmacytic, but I can't say the MAB drugs. Do you foresee a shift towards new treatment modalities? You've already mentioned CAR T or biospecific antibodies.
Well, I see well, everything is going to exist. First of all, multiple myeloma is not multiple for no reason. We said multiple myeloma because we have not been able, contrary to the lymphoma field, to already say, okay, you have a multiple myeloma 1114, a multiple myeloma X, a multiple myeloma Z. We do not have yet that separation in groups clearly identify with different treatments. We do not have that yet in myeloma, and we might get there at some point. But still, despite myeloma is multiple, so there will be patients with CAR approach upfront. There will be patients with T-cell engagers, single agent monotherapy approach upfront. But there will be patients that will need a T-cell engager in combination. And there will be patients where one of the drug in combination might be one hand the T-cell engager and on the other hand the CD38 MAB monoclonal antibody in combination. And you will have patients that cannot receive a CAR, cannot receive a T-cell engager, and might be treated with microduped regimen that logically should be updated in 5 years. But for some patients, might remain an excellent approach, safe enough, not too complex, cheap enough by then, because by then 4 drugs will be then generic. And so I don't think there will never be one treatment for all patients in myeloma. And the more and more, it's going to be very, very much tailored. But it's fair to say that the T cell engager, BCMA CD3, and the CAR T, particularly the BCMA, might take over a great part of the first line upfront treatment regimen options to great number of patients, and probably the fittest one.
You're so deep into it. When I prepare for conversations such as this, I reflect back on my time at medical school and how Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, as it was then known, how the treatment options for these diseases have changed dramatically. So thank you to you and your profession for what you've done for these patients.
In April, we welcomed 2 leaders in the field. Shaji Kumar from the Mayo Clinic discussed advances in myeloma treatment, particularly in novel drug combinations and the role of the bone marrow microenvironment. John Riches, clinical reader for hemato-oncology at the Barts Cancer Institute, shared insights from his pioneering research into how metabolic changes influence B-cell activation and drive lymphoma progression. Let's hear more from John on his groundbreaking work.
Can you break down why metabolism is such a critical factor in understanding and treating lymphomas?
Well, I mean, it's just absolutely fundamental thing. For any cell that is growing and proliferating, it needs to have a metabolism that supports that. So for a cell to make another cell, it needs to be able to make a full complement of DNA, RNA, organelles, cell membranes, you name it, it needs to make it. And so it needs to have that the kind of it needs to kind of basically rewire its metabolism to sort of set that up, and a lot of oncogenes are involved in doing exactly that. And so the idea is that obviously one of the features of cancer over the last 20 years is people have done a lot of genotyping of it and a lot of genomic analysis of it, and it's just really highlighted the complexity of the problem. But a lot of these things are converging on the same sort of pathways one way or another. And the idea is that metabolism is one of these kind of key areas that a cell needs, and that if we really begin to understand it, then we can develop new therapies and look at it as developing in the clinic. And it's not just traditional pharmaceutical therapies, drugs that block particular enzymes or transporters, but also, and I think this is a really important thing that's again come to the fore over the last few years, is looking at the interaction with what people eat, people's diet. So I think it's fundamental there. It's also really important for what we do in terms of in the clinic. So we use metabolism. Glucose uptake is the basis of CT PET scanning. So you give patients basically labeled glucose. That then admits something that can be detected by these PET cameras. That allows us to see what cells in the body and where they are that are using lots of glucose, and it's a really important way of detecting and staging lymphomas and seeing basically how much lymphoma a patient has got, and also really importantly measuring response to therapy. So we talk about this term of patients being PET negative after the first few rounds of treatment, and that's a really helpful biomarker of how patients respond. So there's all of these various ways in which
May focused on cutting-edge developments in leukemia. Dwi Nguyen, lecturer and group leader at the Centre for Hemato-Oncology at the Barts Cancer Institute, spoke about breakthroughs in acute myeloid leukemia. This was followed by Paolo Gallipoli, also from the Barts Cancer Centre, who explored the biology, onset, and treatment strategies for myeloid leukemias.
Looking ahead, what excites you most about the future of leukemia research? Where do you hope to see the biggest, and where do you hope personally to make the biggest impact over the next 5 to 10 years of your career?
So as I said, I think understanding therapy resistance and developing better therapies, and that will require both identifying targets, but as I said, also identifying markers for patients likely to respond to certain therapies. So that getting better therapies is definitely something that I would like to develop. The other thing I would say is obviously understanding the heterogeneity better, and why patients with the same mutation sometimes can be having such different outcomes. So, you have, in our clinical practice, we see this all the time, but also in the studies, you can see that there's certain patients which on paper, they look the same in terms of their disease biology. They should be the same. And actually they do very differently. And why is that? And can we understand that a bit better? Because that would be very important in order to get the therapies right as well. So I think these are the things where I think we should focus mostly.
Yeah, a more personalized approach, and we see that in all cancers, don't we?
Yeah.
Variability.
June was a particularly rich month, with several episodes focused on myeloma genetics, CAR T cell therapy, and B cell disorders. Let's hear more from Lydia Scarfo from Università Vita Salute San Raffaele on emerging therapeutic options for chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
You recently spoke about moving away from chemoimmunotherapy for chronic lymphocytic leukemia and utilizing novel targeted therapies more. Can you share what's driving this shift and how these newer treatments are changing the landscape of CLL management for both clinicians and of course, patients?
Thank you, because I think this is a very important point for the discussion. I'm focusing my clinical and research activity, as you mentioned, on chronic lymphocytic leukemia. That is actually the most frequent adult leukemia in the Western world. And in the last few years, we have seen great advancement in the treatment of this disease. Because, as you correctly mentioned, until few years ago, we only had the chemoimmunotherapy available, and we didn't like the chemoimmunotherapy options because they were associated with long-term adverse events, and they could not achieve long-lasting disease control in a relevant proportion of cases. So in the last few years, several so-called targeted agents, meaning drugs that work by targeting specific mechanism of the leukemic cells, became available in everyday clinical practice. First, the covalent BTK inhibitors. We have now several different covalent BTK inhibitors that are targeting proliferation of CLL cells and reduce the survival of CLL cells, also by detaching them from the supporting microenvironment. And the other key drugs that recently became available are the BCL2 inhibitors. So we have venetoclax currently available, and they can be used in the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia, either together, these two classes of drugs, or sequentially, in order to achieve long-term disease control. And when I started working with patients with CLL, as mentioned, we had several types of chemoimmunotherapy, but the most effective ones basically could not be administered in the majority of patients because they were too intensive, and they were meant only for young, fit patients. While these novel targeted agents we now gained in our therapeutic armamentarium, they are generally well tolerated and can be effective. And now we shifted from administering them in a continuous way, that was our first strategy in this setting, to combining them in order to define fixed duration schemes that can be administered for a while, and then patients can go to, let's say, treatment holidays, because they are defined as time without treatment when the patient is enjoying a normal life, let's say.
Yeah. And important to communicate this to patients, because certainly in my lifetime, the diagnosis of one of these dyscrasias was a death sentence. And because of the work of folks like you, it isn't. And you can convert these very nasty diseases into chronic diseases. And there are a range of other options. And that must be so immensely satisfying for you, and obviously wonderful for the patients, right?
And in this regard, you are absolutely right, because recently we were able to demonstrate that patients with CLL treated with these novel targeted agents had actually the same life expectancy of general population, same age and same gender. So this was a very reassuring message, and it's full of hope for the patients and for the physicians taking care of patients with CLL.
That concludes part 1 of this special highlights episode. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so you never miss an episode, and do share it with friends and colleagues. Join us again in part 2, where we continue reflecting on this remarkable year. Until then, I'm Dr. Catherine Glass, and I thank you for listening to Hema Now. Please stay safe, stay well, and stay curious. Bye for now.